How many of you are familiar with the drug marijuana? What about the war on drugs? While many of you may have never tried it, the topic of legalizing marijuana is widely discussed and well known, especially among our age group, as teenage marijuana use is at its highest level in years. I believe that it's time to decriminalize marijuana, as the current way of enforcing marijuana prohibition is outdated, unjust, and often very racially biased. Decades of racially biased marijuana convictions have caused widespread damage within communities of color, and we must address this issue by focusing on reform, drug education, and expunging of prior discriminatory marijuana convictions rather than the current system of absolute criminalization. While this issue may be unfortunately deeply rooted in our criminal justice system, decriminalizing marijuana is one of the first steps in many of moving towards a more progressive and fair America for all. I believe that in order to make any progress as a society regarding this issue, we must shift our attention away from the criminalization and absolute prohibition of marijuana, which is systematically built upon racial bias, and more on reform and educating the public on both of the benefits and risks. This belief has affected me as it has made me realize that the current unfair social construction of America makes white businessmen millionaires and black males prisoners, which frustrates me, subsequently inspiring me to actively volunteer against, properly educate myself on, and protest this issue by using my voice to bring attention to this injustice that has been ignored and overlooked for too many years. The criminalization of marijuana is rooted in a deeply racist history and has devastated minority communities. Studies show that the usage of this drug is consistent across racial groups, but arrests of minorities are nevertheless higher than the rest of white offenders. Sentencing laws for nonviolent drug crimes have led to the mass incarceration of thousands of Americans, stripped thousands of their basic civil rights, and decimated the social, economic, and familial structure of neighborhoods throughout the country. This belief has shaped my perspective on the world, as it has inspired my passion for advocacy of social, economic, and racial justice. And while I will never fully understand the struggle while being a white woman in America, it is unfair for me or anyone else in my position to sit back and watch as these racial injustices occur daily without using my voice or privilege to do something about it. Today, mass incarceration defines the meaning of blackness in America. Black people, especially black men, are criminals. The temptation is to insist that black men choose to be criminals. The system does not make them criminals. African Americans are not significantly more likely to use or sell prohibited drugs than whites, but they are made criminals at drastically higher rates for precisely the same conduct. Though punitive federal and state drug laws and increased political and monetary incentives, the United States has chose to condemn drug users as criminals rather than approach them for public health and addiction perspective. The overwhelming number of drug possession offenses can be attributed to one drug, marijuana. While African Americans are no more likely to commit a drug offense than a white person, they are disproportionately arrested. It is important that those of us fortunate enough to have a voice use it to speak up against these issues, fighting for and giving a voice to those who are voiceless, who are incarcerated behind bars. This belief is important because while it may not affect most of us directly, there are thousands of people unfairly incarcerated right now for very minor marijuana convictions, more often than not based on prejudice and our small crimes that usually do not deserve the punishment set in place. This belief changed my behavior or thinking, as it has made me even more passionate about fighting for equality, and wonder how many popular ideas or beliefs today are based off of prejudice in our nation's history or systemic racism. A 2013 report from the American Civil Liberties Union found that between 2001 and 2010, there were 8.2 million marijuana-related arrests in the USA. During this time, blacks were 3.7 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession than whites, despite the fact that blacks and whites use marijuana at similar rates. The statistic reveals the extreme racial disparity in marijuana possession arrests, resulting in a highly disproportionate number of blacks being criminalized. Many of the ideas and laws set in place in our nation today, specifically those surrounding drug usage, are outdated and minor, and mirror a time of racial segregation and discrimination, and they need to be addressed and reworked if progress is ever to be made. This belief might affect others, as a new way of thinking regarding marijuana prohibition could enable many previous offenders to re-enter society with a fresh start, allowing them to get jobs and support their local communities. This belief also allows people to broaden their view of the world, causing them to recognize the various racial injustices that still exist within the system today, despite America's effort to move towards equality since the infamous Civil War that occurred around almost 160 years ago now. While our nation has a long way to go before we can declare ourselves champions of equality, starting with the decriminalization of marijuana is a great first step in paving the way for new laws and a new system built upon education, rehabilitation, and fairness for all. The prohibition of marijuana has a long history of racial bias and stereotyping, which has caused lasting harm amongst communities of color. But shifting focus towards decriminalization and education can help change that by reducing the amount of drug-related crimes, fighting against mass incarceration, especially of people of color, and enabling the previous minor offenders to re-enter society with a clean slate. Now is just as good as a time as ever to shift our focus towards decriminalization, as the current practice of marijuana prohibition is not only outdated and unjust, but it is also built upon decades of racial prejudice.